Welcome back everybody. Today's video number 5 in my series for this hobby store haul, specifically starting to look at Rebrickable parts list, generating a digital inventory. That's what the previous two videos were about. I now have that inventory built up all the way, ended up with over 1,000 pieces. So let's backtrack quickly and look at some slopes and then come back to my analysis. These two are vintage peak and they make a 90-degree turn, so they only release those in a couple of roof packs. I also have some other vintage slopes that have been updated over the years. So this is the updated one. This was in our Hue tap, and then the vintage one actually is a little more pointy and it has a different underside stud gripping mechanism. Here's some 1x2 slopes with a hollow inside. These are the kind of pieces that are going to be contributing to the price and the value of the lot because they're harder to find now. So with that kind of stuff in mind, these older pieces may be driving up prices a little bit above what we would expect to see. Let's really jump into a step-by-step analysis of this valuation, and then to take things another step, what can we do with this number to maybe estimate a more reasonable value that's closer to what we'd expect our parts to be worth. And there's multiple factors all coming into play. And it's just going to take a little bit of time to work through all of those in just kind of a discussion format. So get nice and comfortable. I'm going to try to work through this as efficiently as possible, but a lot of ground to cover. So the first thing we want to talk about is where Rebrickable gets their value data. Where are these individual numbers coming from? Underneath each piece, if it can find something, it's going to give you an estimate for how much this is worth. And there's a lot of things that come into play there. So just go to this frequently asked questions little box up here under the parts tab, go to the bottom, and it has a section for part prices. That's what I've got pulled up here. There's kind of 3 bullet points that we want to keep in mind. The first thing is the source of the data. And so there are 3 integrated stores, Bricklink, Brickowl, and ToyPro. And these are the websites that resell Lego pieces that's not directly from the Lego company. Now the Lego group does own Bricklink now, but when you actually go buy pieces from Bricklink, you're buying from individual sellers, not the Lego group. So important to keep in mind, these are kind of the independent sources of new and used Lego. The next bullet point is talking about frequency. Is only taking into account prices seen in the last 24 hours, the last full day. And so I'm assuming that there's just some kind of update cycle that goes to these 3 sites and will make a pull of the price information and then update the number underneath each part entry. Finally, it's important to note that the analysis will exclude used pieces and only take into account the new value for parts. So that's kind of throwing everything from the start here. All of the pieces that I picked up at the hobby store are essentially used. Now, some of them are in great condition, yes, but since they're not directly out of the box from a new Lego set, you can't really consider them to be a new piece. So there's such a thing as a used piece in new condition, but all of these values, all these price points are coming from listings that are new in the 3 Lego stores that Rebrickable just mentioned. And so the next thing to look at in the analysis is these 3 Lego stores. Now, Bricklink you've probably heard of. It's definitely the largest group of independent sellers and stores. So it's kind of formed this network now of places to buy Lego. Some stores are quite large and have a large inventory. Some stores a lot smaller and have a limited inventory. But once we get the aggregate data of all the pieces that are for sale, you can start looking at what pieces are actually worth, both in new and used condition. I think the last 6 months sales, which takes an average, is actually a better indicator of where the market is at for most pieces, because this represents the value of pieces that are actually selling, and this is how much people are willing to pay for pieces. However, Rebrickable specifically states that they use the new items that are currently for sale. Remember, it updates every 24 hours, and it can only use prices that it sees in current listings. So the actual values that are showing up on this site are partially coming from everything in this column right here, the current items for sale that are in new condition. So if we start to do a little cross comparison, our quantity average price for any given piece, in this case it's one of my selected pieces for the analysis, quantity average for this specific piece is about $6. Now the quantity average even for new pieces, but looking at the last 6 months sales, closer to $2. And then when you start looking at the used value, quantity average for used that are currently for sale is 21 cents. The quantity average used that have sold in the past 6 months is only 6 cents a piece. So in my case, this specific piece in my Rebrickable parts list that's currently listed at $7.84 is actually more likely worth about 6 cents. So that says a lot about this entire number here, because of course this number is just the sum of all of our little values for each individual piece, and since we have 1,000 of those, that adds up over time. But we can't just say, well, $8 is this many times 6 cents, and so to find the actual value of these pieces, I just make a quick division. Because of the way that individual Lego pieces are worth different amounts of money, sometimes used pieces being worth just as much as new, and then looking at these older pieces where you can't even find pieces in new condition, hardly ever, and so maybe there's only 1 or 2 listings giving this value, that starts to skew the numbers back and forth. And so for the average case, I think this will follow most of the time, where whatever value Rebrickable is giving you here, it's probably a better idea to look at last 6 months sales in used condition for stuff that you pick up from a hobby store. So that's kind of the main overview. If I were to sum this all up in one point, it would be this number is about 5 times too high for new pieces, and then if we're considering everything used, it's probably about 10 times too high. So in reality, this entire lot of pieces may be worth closer to $50. And I mean, I paid about $20 for everything, so at the end of the day, I'm still ahead, but much less so than if I just take this at face value. So if you want to stop watching now, that's fine. That's kind of the gist of the whole thing. But if you want more in-depth analysis of what was interesting to me, and then going forward with the actual values here, the actual data, keep watching. I don't know. The rest of this is just kind of a passion project of mine. The main point is kind of what I just summed up. So that's what I want to get across about using Rebrickable parts list for used bulk lots. And everything else here will just be doing a little bit of a deeper dive into the numbers. So with looking at Bricklink, this is going to account for a majority of our price data, but Rebrickable also mentioned 2 other sources, BrickOwl and ToyPro. Now, BrickOwl is kind of a smaller version of Bricklink, but they are still independent from the Lego group. Now ToyPro, instead of hosting several individual stores, is more similar to a large Bricklink store in that they have a consolidated inventory. It's all shipping from the same warehouse or the same stock, and they are also independent from the Lego group. So everything else, they have slightly different methods of categorization, organization, but you can still find most of the same pieces in new and used conditions. Prices are comparable, probably a little bit higher on average, but again, having a larger inventory to pull from means you can place larger orders most of the time. There is actually quite a few sellers on Bricklink with large inventories, their prices comparable, so just an alternative source for new and used Lego, one that remains independent from the Lego group. So those are kind of our 3 stores, and you'll notice I've got the same piece pulled up on each store. I did want to do a little cross comparison of the value. So we already looked at the one on Bricklink with the quantity average price for new one of these pieces going for about $6. On Rebrickible, the same piece with the same filters, so new, quantity average. It doesn't work it out for us, but it does give us the ones that are listed. And so this is where my Excel workbook comes into play. I used this piece and this data to run a little test, and on our Rebrickible lots we get a quantity average of $6.50 after you work out all the math. So about 50 cents higher than Bricklink, even though we have much fewer lots to work with here. It's comparable just in terms of the price. The last one, Toy Pro, only has one of these in stock in new condition, and it's going for 12 cents. And this is right on the lower end of our Bricklink minimum price here, 19 cents, and also our Rebrickible minimum price, 11 cents. So, comparable value, looking at the lower end of the range, but we can't do a whole lot with quantity average here because there's only one, which makes the quantity average 12 cents. But this will factor in a tiny amount to the value as seen in the parts list, because this represents one single data point that Rebrickable is pulling from. As long as this has been up in the last 24 hours, that is working its way back to this parts list and this particular value. So having all that in mind, and we already got a little look at my Excel analysis. We've got the data from Bricklink, Rebrickible, and Toy Pro. And what you have to start doing with these is account for the bulk of the inventory that will be coming from Bricklink, a smaller amount coming from Rebrickible, and then just a single lot at Toy Pro. So we can't just take an average of the averages. We have to look at most of the price contribution coming from the Bricklink data, which is close to $6. A little bit coming from Rebrickible, and then the Toy Pro, probably insignificant. We didn't even have to include it, but I did anyways. And so your quantity average from all three stores is about $6. And so the math here is just taking the combined value divided by the combined number of lots, pieces for sale. Quantity average coming from the individual ones is of course doing the same thing. To actually get the quantity value, you have to multiply the individual price by the number of lots available. So that's what gives you this number. When you sum up the total value from all the stores on Bricklink, divide that by the number of pieces available, and you get a quantity average. So at the individual level of these three stores, you can kind of compare store to store, and then for all of them combined, we should be seeing something close to $6 on Rebrickable. And depending on when they update their parts list, it might still be using the value as calculated yesterday. So let's go and look at that and see. It's closer to $8, but still within the same order of magnitude. So I think this is more or less what is going on behind the scenes on Rebrickable. Just looking at the averages and the math involved to arrive at something that takes all of these lots into account. Now, if we go to kind of a subset here of pieces, I picked 10 pieces from the lot to kind of track over the period of 10 days, because while this provides a snapshot, this is going to change every 24 hours. And over the course of a week or so, you might see these values fluctuate enough to radically change the total value of a lot. So in anticipation of making this video for the channel and kind of knowing I would want to have a history for the analysis, I started recording values back in December. So on this tab of my Excel workbook, there's quite a bit going on. For now, let's just focus in here on the top half of the table, and this is where I did a history price tracker for these 10 pieces. So these are the ones in the list I just looked at. We'll go back in a second. But starting on the 15th of December, I entered in the values as seen on Rebrickable, and then did that for the next 9 days and got a 10-day price tracker, and I also added up the value of all the pieces, so there were just over 1,000, and I got the kind of 10-day running values for the entire lot. So remember what I was saying with the fluctuation, how much does that actually affect my list of 1,000 pieces? We saw values range from $585 all the way up to $785. So a $200 difference here between the high and the low, the max and the min, which is pretty significant, and that's kind of why I wanted to take averages of these values to get a better picture of what we would actually want to get in terms of data. So we're still using values that are assuming we have new pieces, and it's pulling stuff from these websites and kind of conglomerating them. So it's still going to be higher than what we see on just Bricklink, even for new parts. But now we have a little bit more of an average idea. It's not something that's updating every 24 hours. It's still kind of a narrow window to look at. It's just 10 days out of the year. So again, like I mentioned, I definitely prefer that Bricklink 6-month average for what's actually selling. But in this case, this is what I have to work with. So I did this for 10 days and then moved on. So the average value of the lot is closer to $680. And more or less, if I come back to this day after day, I should see it kind of centered on this number. Some days will be higher, some days will be down. So what I want from these averages is just kind of a sanity check on the values that Rebrickable is giving me every day. And I can kind of look through here, even though things are going up and down, what is it kind of tending towards in this 10-day span? So those are the numbers that I wanted to use for the analysis. I've got those with the average now. The other thing I did for each of these 10 pieces is look at Bricklink value new on the 6-month average and the used value on the 6-month average. In my case, these are much more applicable values for my pieces. They actually represent what I have better than the Rebrickable values do. And I'll be using these to kind of make a little scaling factor that I can apply to the total average as well, and get a better idea, even though it's probably still going to be a little on the high end, much more reasonable assumption for the value of these pieces. And that's what I have to look at in the second half of the workbook. So again, we have the same 10 parts. Now let's just go back and review those real quick. The highest value part that only showed up for 2 of the 10 days, most of the time it doesn't have a price available, is this kind of a fin with the clip right back here. And you start looking at how many times this has shown up. It's only been in 6 sets. So that's contributing for sure to its value. Some of the other ones in here are a little bit higher priced, and then maybe more of an average piece. Still not in many sets, but it's much less specific. So coming back to my Excel workbook, for each of these 10 parts, we have the new and the used values from Bricklink. And what you want to do here is kind of follow one specific part all the way through. You can go on a row by row basis, because each piece is heavily determined, the value is heavily determined by how many times it was available, the size of the piece, and so you can't really make a general assumption on a piece by piece basis. You can look at values and numbers from an entire lot once you've summed everything up, but when we do focus in here on a smaller list of pieces, we want to keep things very individualized. So the first thing I calculated is the scale factor, and this is just looking at how much a used piece is worth compared to a new piece. For this first piece here, it's actually not that much different. A used one is about $7 and a new one is about $9. And so our scale factor is 0.8, which just means a used one is worth 0.8 of a new one. As you work your way down here, you'll see a variety of scale factors. There's an outlier that is 1.6, which in this case, the 6-month average for a used piece is actually higher than the 6-month average for a used one. and that was this tan 4733. This studs not on top piece is actually skewed a little bit for some reason. So interesting to kind of see one that flips the trend, but maybe an exception to the rule here that kind of proves the case. So we have our scale factor. Now the next thing to do is we have a new value from Bricklink, a new value from Rebrickable. We can actually apply the scale factor to the new values from Rebrickable and essentially get what the used value from Rebrickable would be if they tracked used pieces. And this is where it gets into a little bit of speculation, but since Bricklink does represent a majority of the price data in this analysis, I think it's still worth doing, just in terms of making rough estimates and rough guesses. Won't be skewed too much. Just interesting to see what maybe a used Rebrickable value would look like. So the scaled Rebrickable value is taking the scale factor from Bricklink, multiplying it by our average values from Rebrickable. So just copying these in that were calculated from the 10-day running average right here, and then spitting out a scaled value to represent the used pieces that I bought at JCD and Hobby. And more or less, if I wanted to do this thoroughly, I would go through and do this for all 1,000 pieces. I'm not insane, so I only did 10, but interesting nonetheless to see how pieces compare. So we get a value that's in between the new value as seen on Rebrickable and the used value that's seen on Bricklink. Because Rebrickable values for the most part are higher than Bricklink values, and I think most of that is contributed by higher prices coming from Brick Owl and Toy Pro. So these sites do not have the same volume that Bricklink has. To make up for that, I think on average their lots are more expensive. Not always the case, and in fact for this particular piece is only marginally higher from Brick Owl. But looking at what there is in terms of inventory volume, it's much lower. So if you are a dedicated Brick Owl seller or buyer, there's just less options to choose from, and probably more often than not, you will only have stuff that is priced on average higher than Bricklink is. Same thing goes for Toy Pro. They only have a single stock to select from. In this case, again, on the lower end of what we saw in both other stores. But start looking around at other pieces, and probably this is the exception to the rule, looking at most pieces having a higher price. And all that works its way back to these values as seen on Rebrickable. So the last thing that I kind of did here for my analysis was scaling the value of the entire lot. Again, our average was about $680 over the course of 10 days. In fact, we can look at our lot today, and we've got a value of $562. So a little below the average, but again, within an order of magnitude, we're all kind of following the trend. So this average from Rebrickable, assuming we have new parts, only taking into account the last 24 hours, starting to get rid of that bias a little bit by running an average for 10 days. But that only takes care of our 24 running average. We want to account for the pieces being used and not new. That's why I brought in the scale factor. And so kind of the culminating point of all of this analysis and data is saying we have the average value from Rebrickable, multiply that by the average scale factor. So now in this case we're taking all of the scales for the individual pieces, averaging that out and multiplying that by the lot value to get a scaled value of $285.59. Now in my opinion, this is still too high. This is a lot of 1,000 used pieces, and to actually move these, you'd have to price them a lot closer to the 6-month average from Bricklink. So maybe in the future I'll do a more involved analysis where I'm actually going to these values, but this is the data that I had to enter for this analysis right here. Significant, but doable. If I start looking at 6-month sales for used pieces, there's loads of seller data from Bricklink. And Bricklink is what I want to use because it's accounting for a majority of the market, just in terms of what we want to look at. What are pieces worth? Used, new, all that stuff. Pretty much want to use Bricklink for that. And thankfully, we do have quantity averages, max and mins, time sold, total quantity, all of that comes into play. So if I do go down this road in the future, I'll be using these for sure. Of course, looking at exporting all of this with XML directly into Excel, possible, but not going down that road, just so that I can do a more precise estimate for pieces that I'm probably not even going to sell. In fact, I'm just doing this kind of for fun, and it's like I mentioned at the split point for this video. If you're not really into data that much, this is just boring as beans. So for those of you still watching, for whatever reason, I guess I'll just say this is more reasonable for looking at the value of a bulk lot, especially compared to something that's saying I have $700 worth of Lego in 1,000 pieces. Kind of tackling the two main issues I have with Rebrickable being the 24-hour ruling part valuation and only looking at new piece values. Again, taking care of those biases by averaging piece values out over 10 days and scaling it down using Bricklink used versus new data. Applying that to 10 individual pieces and looking at trends, and then applying that as an average to the entire value to scale it down. We're getting under $300. Looking at how that actually compares to the price I paid for stuff. With tax, it was $21.78 for these pieces. Just looking at the full value that Rebrickable states, that would be an increase of 31.3 times the value. Looking at the scaled, it's about a 13 multiple factor increase. Just, the number here representing if I bought this element for 1 cent, I could turn around and sell it for 13 cents, and then scaling that up to everything in the lot. So interesting. This still being over 10 times my purchase value for even the scaled down factor, which means either the Bricklink is being too generous on the scale factor, or I'm very good at picking pieces that are valuable, or most likely a combination of both. The pieces that I picked were indeed valuable and hold their value, and the specific 10 pieces that I used for my analysis are probably on the high end of the scaling factor, used versus new. The only way around that is to do more involved analysis, more Excel workbooks, more time spent looking at digital Lego pieces, and I think I'd just rather spend that time building with physical bricks. So that'll kind of wrap up my 5-part series here. Again, this one quite a bit more involved, going down the rabbit trail with some Excel calculations, pulling data from different stores. But the main takeaway, again, being don't trust this value per se. Keep in mind what pieces you have, but also know where this data is coming from. Important to be informed. Read the frequently asked questions. You'll learn a lot. I know I did. I know I learned a lot making this video and running these numbers, but I think that's it for me for a while doing this kind of thing. But I also picked up some bricks and minifigs pieces the other day, and I think I'll be doing something like this again soon. At least I'll be building a digital inventory. I won't be making all of this crap. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. I think I'm going to call that good.